It was a stifling late afternoon in the backlands of São Braulino, a village encircled by mountains and forgotten by updated maps, where time itself seemed to have slowed down on purpose. The last rays of the sun bathed the cornfield in shades of orange, stretching as far as weary eyes could see, like a living, undulating carpet. Atop a small hill, the old farmer Adelcio Barbosa watched the field with a proud gaze. It was his favorite time of day. When the crows withdrew, the crickets began rehearsing the night's first orchestra, and the scent of warm earth rose, carrying with it the buried secrets of generations. But that afternoon, something broke the usual rhythm. The chapel bells did not toll at 6. The wind blew in the opposite direction, and all the oxen in the pasture lowed in unison, as if answering a call that no human had yet perceived. Adelcio, a man with calloused hands and silent faith, turned with effort and began walking back to the farmhouse, leaning on a hand-carved staff. His dragging, weary steps reflected the weight of someone carrying more than years. He carried pacts. As he passed through the wooden gate, he found his eldest son, André, red-eyed, holding a sweat-stained envelope in his trembling hands. "It's from there. It came today," he murmured, handing over the yellowed paper stamped with the circle's seal. The old man read in silence. Then he took a deep breath. "It's time." Those 2 words were enough to set everything in motion. The cattle were brought in, the lanterns lit. The family gathered around the table, where a single candle flickered beneath a worn crucifix. No one spoke a word. It was a ritual that had been carried out for over 100 years, a ritual that could never be interrupted. That very night, when the full moon overtook the sky and the cicadas fell into sudden silence, Adelcio put on the dark robe kept under lock and key in the bottom of an old chest. He walked to the center of the cornfield, where a circle of stones marked a sacred space. There, he knelt before the scarecrow wearing his own straw hat. The motionless figure seemed to watch him with hollow eyes sewn from old cloth. Adelcio began to chant in a language he had learned from his grandfather, spoken only on payment nights. The ground around him seemed to breathe. The leaves rustled, though there was no wind. And then, he pulled from his pocket a piece of still warm meat, wrapped in a hand-embroidered cloth bearing the family's name. He buried it at the center of the circle and recited the final words. When he finished, a subterranean sigh swept through the cornfield, as if the earth had swallowed something with deep satisfaction. The next day, the villagers awoke to the news. Adelcio had been found dead in his room, eyes rolled back, his body entangled in roots that had burst through the wooden floor. In the fields, the corn had grown twice as tall as expected, golden as the sun and perfectly aligned. The harvest would be the best of the decade, and no one, absolutely no one, dared to question the price. It was a cloudy morning when Lucas Moreira's rented car wound its way through the dusty dirt roads that carved into the heart of the Minas Gerais backlands, swallowing miles and red dust with every turn. On the passenger seat, a weathered notebook rested atop a pile of agricultural reports. Lucas, 29, an agronomy graduate from the Federal University of Viçosa, had come to São Braulino under the pretense of a university project investigating traditional methods of sustainable farming. Or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. The truth was, after losing his father to an aggressive cancer and breaking off an engagement without warning, Lucas simply wanted to disappear from the world for a while. And São Braulino, a village barely visible on Google Maps, seemed like the perfect place to vanish. As he passed beneath the old wooden arch that read, São Braulino, land of people of faith, he felt the air thicken strangely, as though the atmosphere itself tested those who entered. The adobe and timber houses mixed with tin roofs, and the silence was almost sacred. No dogs barked, no radios played, only the sound of tires sinking into damp soil. In the village's tiny center, 3 elders watched him from a porch, motionless, like salt statues. Lucas waved. No one responded. Here, time didn't pass. It simply repeated. The inn where he would stay, called Kak, Harvest's Rest, was a refurbished old house filled with dark wooden furniture and a scent that blended peroba oil with a faint hint of tobacco. Donna Irene, the owner, was a sweet-voiced woman with the eyes of someone who knew more than she let on. "Welcome, young man. I hope your stay is productive," she said, with a subtle pause before the last word. She led him to the back room, where the window opened to an endless sea of cornfields, swaying slowly, even without wind. In the first few days, Lucas tried to stay busy. He visited some rural properties, took notes, snapped photos, but soon he began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. The crops followed no modern method of farming. There were no signs of irrigation, chemical fertilizers, or pest control, yet the corn thrived, glowing, in rows so perfect they seemed calculated. It was as if the land itself conspired in favor of the harvest. And the farmers? They avoided talking, always polite, but distant. When he asked about techniques, they changed the subject. When he mentioned the records he had read, reports of droughts in nearby regions, they chuckled nervously and said, "Here, the land is good, always has been. It's a gift." On one of these visits, he met Otacilio, the oldest and most influential farmer in the region. A tall man with a firm voice and eyes far too light for his sun-worn skin. He received Lucas with dry hospitality, like someone inspecting new cattle in the pen. "Came to study the land, did you? Then know this. The land here has a will of its own. Those who listen, harvest. Those who doubt, are lost." Lucas gave a nervous smile, trying to take the phrase as a metaphor. But Otacilio's stare did not blink. It was a warning, unspoken, but unmistakable. That night, Lucas decided to take a walk around the area. The starless sky seemed to push the darkness downward. In the distance, the cornfields whispered to one another, as if carrying voices trapped between leaves. A cold shiver crawled down his spine. He turned to head back, but before he could reach the dirt road, he heard a muffled sound, a laugh, or perhaps a cry, coming from deep within the plantation. Frozen, he considered entering. But then, he saw a figure at the edge of the field, still slender, wearing a straw hat. A scarecrow. Except, seconds before, it hadn't been there. Shaken, Lucas backed away and chose not to speak of it the next morning. But from that moment on, everything would change. Because in São Braulino, no one is just a visitor. The land, silent and alive, decides who enters, and more importantly, who will never leave. Over the following weeks, Lucas delved deeper into his technical and experimental observations. It was impossible to ignore the absurdly positive outcomes of São Braulino's harvests. Even amid a prolonged drought affecting most of the state, the village boasted productivity beyond any statistical model. The corn was tall, dense, vibrant, with cobs overflowing with golden, uniform kernels. No signs of borers, rust, or mold, no insect attacks. Even the presence of birds seemed strangely controlled, as if something invisible kept them at bay. Anywhere else, such phenomena would be credited to luck, genetic engineering, or technological advancements. But here, it was something different, something ancient, something that seemed to stare back. Lucas began documenting the details with obsessive precision. Plant measurements, soil moisture, water pH, sun exposure, all normal, all too perfect. During a visit to São Otacilio's farm, he noticed something odd. The seeds used there didn't come from any known supplier. They were stored in burlap sacks tied with vines, kept in a dark, damp room that reeked of incense and wet earth. "They're heirloom seeds, passed down through generations," said Otacilio, catching the young man's curiosity. "Not for sale, and shouldn't be touched by those who don't know how to ask permission." Those words echoed in Lucas's mind. Ask permission? What kind of permission should one ask of a seed? That night, he decided to investigate on his own. He began walking along the borders of the farms at night, discreetly photographing the cornfields, analyzing the plantations by moonlight. On one of these nights, he stumbled upon something half-buried between the rows of corn, a carved stone inscribed with symbols that resembled ancient runes, with a hole in its center, as if used in some sort of ritual. Around it, the soil was darker, more alive. Lucas pulled the stone from the earth with his bare hands, and immediately felt a sharp pain in his stomach, a wave of vertigo. The surrounding sounds ceased. Even the corn stopped swaying. Frightened, he stepped back and decided to hide the stone in his room at the inn. But that night, he couldn't sleep. The candle by his bedside flickered, as if caught in a storm, even though the windows were shut tight. And then the sounds began. Whispers from outside, incomprehensible voices, a slow, dragging chant that seemed to come from multiple mouths at once. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamt of an endless field, where every scarecrow was a person, with eyes torn out and mouths sewn shut with corn silk. At the center of the field stood a hooded figure watching him, and in its hand, it held the very same stone he had pulled from the earth. The next morning, he tried to confront Donna Irene about the strange events. She simply said, in a hushed voice, eyes fixed on her coffee cup, "Some things are better left buried, Mr. Lucas. Stir the soil, and it will collect its due." He forced a smile, but deep down he already knew. He had passed the point of no return. His records began to show glitches, photos deleted, files corrupted, notebook pages torn with no explanation. But what disturbed him the most was the absence of one particular man, Zé Raimundo, a farmhand he'd spoken with during his second week. In a rare, drunken confession, Zé had told him, "The land here isn't just fertile, it's hungry." 3 days later, Zé Raimundo disappeared. They claimed he had left to care for a sick mother. But Lucas knew it was a lie. In truth, no one even mentioned his name anymore. It was as if he had never existed. Lucas resolved to continue his investigation, even with the growing unease in his chest. After all, a scientist isn't defeated by superstition. He decided to return to where he had found the buried stone, only to discover that nothing was there anymore. The corn had grown unnaturally thick in that area, forming a perfect circle around where the stone had once been. In the center now stood a new scarecrow, wearing the same striped shirt Zé Raimundo had been wearing the last time Lucas saw him. The corn kept growing, tall, golden, hungry. The nights in São Braulino had become torture for Lucas. It was no longer just the unease of a stranger on foreign land. Now there was something deeper, something visceral. It felt as if the land itself were watching him, as if the soil beneath his feet breathed to a rhythm of its own, an ancient, ritualistic, living rhythm. The plants seemed to lean ever so slightly in his direction when he passed, and the once harmless corn kernels now resembled eyes, countless golden eyes, watching him from every angle. When darkness fell, he heard the whispers. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but soon he realized the sound came not from above, but from below, from the earth. Muffled voices like dozens of mouths trying to speak through the soil. One day, he decided to investigate an area that had always felt wrong. A section of Su Otacilio's cornfield that, curiously, no worker ever touched. It was marked by 3 large, moss-covered black stones arranged in a crescent shape. The corn there grew taller, but the stalks looked twisted, like arms struggling to break free from beneath. In the center, he found something unexpected. A hole, sealed with an old wooden lid etched with symbols carved by knife. A frayed rope trailed out of the opening, as if something, or someone, had once been pulled out, or locked inside. Lucas knelt down, hesitant, placed his ear to the wood, and he heard, clearly, 3 words, in Portuguese, whispered so thinly it sliced like paper. "We are still." He staggered back, choking on his breath. His hands trembled. His mouth went dry. He wanted to run, to flee, but when he turned, he saw someone watching him from afar. An old woman, her face veiled in black, standing motionless among the corn, holding a sickle. He blinked. She vanished. No footprints, no path, no trace, only a silence, heavier than before. That night, Lucas was consumed by a nightmare so vivid he woke drenched in sweat, with dried blood crusted at the edge of his ears. In the dream, he was buried up to his neck in the middle of the cornfield while hooded figures chanted around him. The soil pulsed beneath. Beside him was a familiar face, Zé Raimundo, staring with completely white eyes, repeating the same phrase over and over. "She wants you to see." The next day, Lucas made up his mind to dig. He returned to the place where he'd heard the voices and pried open the wooden lid using a crowbar stolen from the inn. The stench that escaped was indescribable, a fusion of mold, rot, and rusted metal. With a trembling flashlight in hand, he descended the narrow steps into what seemed like a subterranean cellar carved from stone. The walls pulsed with thick, tangled roots, and in every corner hung small figures made of straw and bone, amulets of some forgotten faith. At the center of the room, on a stone altar, lay an old journal, its leather cover scarred by claw marks. On the first page, written in red ink, "To the Son of the Earth, who will one day see." The following pages described rituals practiced over a century ago, rituals of blood, of fertility, of offering. They recounted the origin of the heart of the cornfield, a being or entity that lives in the soil, dormant, but hungry. Every 7 moons, the blood of a fool who dares to listen must be spilled to renew the bounty. The journal detailed the transformation of the village, once a poor, pest-ridden community, later a prosperous agricultural haven. But the harvest came at a cost, always a cost. Lucas emerged from the pit paler than he had ever been. He tried to speak to Donna Irene, who grew stern. "You shouldn't have disturbed it, boy. Now you belong." And that same night, while the cornfield swayed under windless skies, he heard the voices again, louder, clearer, calling his name. Lucas spent the following days in a state of sleepless vigilance. He barely slept, kept the lights on, and wore Donna Irene's crucifix pressed to his chest, more out of desperation than faith. He was no longer the rational, skeptical young man who had first arrived in São Braulino. The soil had spoken to him. The walls of the earth had shown him secrets that could not be unseen. He wandered the village like a ghost, studying the villagers' faces, which now seemed like masks, with forced smiles and hollow eyes. Every night, the whispers grew louder, and each morning, the scarecrows appeared to have moved a little closer. One of them, the one nearest the road, now wore a handkerchief around its neck, the same one Lucas had seen hanging in Zé Raimundo's room. On the Friday of the 3rd week, a letter slipped beneath his door, thick, aged paper with a single sentence written on it. "Come see what sustains our abundance." On the back, a crude drawing of a bleeding corn cob and a hand-drawn map. It was an invitation, or a summons. Against all reason, Lucas chose to follow it. Perhaps it was his only chance to truly understand what was happening, or to escape. He grabbed a flashlight, a pocket knife, and shoved the old journal into his backpack. He set out at dusk, when the village fell into that unnatural silence, as if everyone were bracing for what was to come. The path led him to a hidden clearing at the center of the cornfield, a place not found on any map, and never could be. The plants thickened around him, forming a living corridor that closed behind him as he moved forward. And then, breaking through the final line of stalks, he saw it. A ring of lit torches illuminating a clearing of hard-packed dirt, where around 30 people in dark robes stood in a circle around a stone altar. At the center, a kneeling woman, blindfolded, her hands tied behind her back. She muttered prayers, or were they laments? Lucas froze, hidden among the leaves, torn between fleeing or watching, until a familiar voice echoed through the air. "He is here." It was Seu Otacílio. He stood at the center of the circle, robeless, dressed only in work pants and a white shirt, a rural priest in every sense. His face showed no surprise. It was as if he had always known Lucas would come. With emotion, he summoned him forward, and no one stopped Lucas as he stepped from the shadows. Hypnotized, drawn by something stronger than fear. The woman's eyes opened, eyes Lucas vaguely recognized from a visit to a farmhouse. Just before 2 men covered her face with a black cloth. Otacílio stepped forward, holding a blackened corn cob, its kernels twisted like teeth. "You heard the land. You read the words. Now you understand what we do." Lucas shook his head in denial, but his legs wouldn't move. "All abundance has a price. And this soil, my son, this soil demands the blood of those who dare to dig too deep." Around them, the crowd began a guttural chant, a circular melody spiraling inside Lucas's mind. The voices echoed not just in the air, but inside his bones. Then he saw it. The altar's carved grooves ran along the floor, forming channels that connected to a central pit, the same pit once used for offerings. When blood spilled across the altar, it was drawn directly into the earth, feeding whatever lay beneath. Otacílio came closer now, holding an ancient dagger engraved with the same symbols Lucas had seen in the journal. "You have 2 choices. Leave, and the land will collect violently. Or stay, learn, and serve. Lucas closed his eyes. For a brief moment, all fell silent. And then, screams, chaos. From above, a blinding light tore through the clouds. A lightning bolt struck one of the torches. The earth shook, the air filled with the scent of sulfur and burning flesh. Someone fell. Another ran. The woman broke free. And Lucas, moved by raw instinct, snatched the dagger from Otacilio's hands and bolted toward the forest. Behind him, the chanting turned to howling, but he did not look back, because he knew. It was no longer just humans that chased him. The harvest had been interrupted, and the hunger of the earth awakened. Lucas ran without direction, guided only by the terror pounding at the back of his neck and the images his mind refused to process. The darkness seemed to close in around him, turning every step into a struggle against invisible roots sprouting from the soil, trying to hold him back. The forest surrounding the cornfields now appeared alive. The trunks creaked as if whispering secrets to one another, and the branches slowly bent toward him. When his feet finally touched the gravel road that led back to the village, Lucas was no longer the same man. Something inside him had cracked. He had seen a cult, but more than that, he had seen the ancient hunger that cults sustained. And now, it was awake. The next morning, he woke in his bed with no memory of how he had returned. His clothes were dry, clean, no blood, no dirt. The open window let in a gentle breeze, almost too soft to be real. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He felt hollowed. Minutes later, Donna Irene entered the room with a forced smile and a tray of porridge. "Just a bad dream, sir. You've been rambling for days. High fever. The country heat messes with city minds." But Lucas wasn't insane. The journal was still hidden in his backpack, along with the evidence, the notes, the ritual drawings, the genealogy of the villagers, and most importantly, the records of concealed deaths going back to the 1800s. In the following days, isolated in his room, Lucas read every page of the journal as if his life depended on it. And in truth, it did. The story of São Braulino didn't begin with settlers or churches. It began with a forgotten tribe, worshipping a being buried deep in the earth, a spirit that controlled soil fertility in exchange for human blood. When the first outsiders arrived and seized the land, they found rich crops and soft soil, but they also found graves and warnings. They ignored them. They planted. They harvested. And with each generation, more disappearances, more pacts, more ceremonies among the corn. Seu Otacilio's lineage traced directly to the cult's original leaders. Every 7 moons, a new cycle began. And when the harvest was too plentiful, the sacrifice had to be greater. Not just of blood, but of identity. Lucas realized, horrified, that the villagers who disappeared weren't killed. They were absorbed, incorporated, erased from the collective memory of the village. Their stories ripped out like dry leaves, their names unspoken, their faces forgotten like a bad dream at dawn. He tried to seek help, called the university, the state government, even the police. All the lines were dead. His phone had lost signal completely. The inn's already weak internet was now gone altogether. He drove off, but the road looped endlessly. Every kilometer, he saw the same fallen tree, the same rusted sign. It was as if he were trapped in a rural labyrinth, reality folding around a single, unchanging point, the cornfield. Desperate to understand the spell's mechanics, Lucas returned to the underground cellar where he had found the journal. But when he arrived, it was sealed. The entrance had vanished. The ground was smooth, as if it had never been disturbed. Only one thing remained. The ritual stone reappeared, now bearing a new inscription, as though burned into the rock. "You were planted." And then, he understood. It wasn't enough to see. It wasn't enough to know. The curse of fertile land was subtle, silent. It crept through the cracks of reason, sprouting like roots in the subconscious. He wasn't being hunted. He was being cultivated, transformed. The land had chosen him, not to die, but to serve. As a scarecrow serves the field, as a guardian watches the silence grow. The village's scarecrows looked different now, more detailed, One of them wore a torn backpack. Lucas Moreira's routine began to follow an invisible cycle, as if time itself in the village had been sewn to the pulse of the earth. He could no longer tell how long had passed since the night of the ritual. Days, weeks. The sunlight seemed erratic, the seasons blending together, heat and cold alternating without logic. Mornings dawned without roosters crowing. Clocks ran too fast or too slow, as if mocking sanity. Lucas began to realize that São Braulino no longer obeyed the laws of the outside world. It was an isolated organism, alive, folding in on itself like an inflamed wound that refused to heal. At one point, he tried to write his own journal, to track his perception of the days, but the notes became scrambled. Words he didn't remember writing appeared on the pages. Crooked letters, different inks, chosen seed. The cycle needs you. The harvest never ends. He thought he was losing his mind. But when he woke up with dirt under his nails and corn leaves under his bed, he understood it wasn't just hallucination. He was being shaped, cultivated. One stormy night he decided to escape, flee on foot, with a flashlight and the journal wrapped in plastic. But the village seemed to fold in on itself. The houses repeated, the trees spun. He returned to his starting point 3 times, even after taking different paths. When he tried to cross the pasture behind the old abandoned farm, he found something that froze his heart. A new scarecrow, tall, with arms too long, clothes still wet with blood, and human eyes, green eyes, his eyes. The scarecrow had his face. Lucas fainted. He woke hours later on the inn's porch. Donna Irene offered him rue tea and simply said, "You don't leave here until you harvest what you've sown." Realizing escape was no longer possible, Lucas decided to study. Not to flee, but to understand. He scoured the books of the deactivated church, documents hidden in basements, even the forgotten confessional, where former priests had left records of failed exorcisms and blessings. One of them had written, "Faith does not sprout where the earth has made a pact with something older than God." He discovered that the villagers referred to the center of the cornfield as the bow, navel of the earth, a dark energy point where the dormant entity, described as a formless creature made of roots, bones, and hunger, resided. It was fed not only with flesh, but with memory. The sacrifices were not just physical, they were existential. People erased, their identities diluted like ashes scattered to the wind, but with no funeral, no name. And the stronger the harvest, the more demanding the entity became. Lucas saw records from past decades and noticed a pattern. Every 7 years, a stranger vanished. A teacher in 1987, a geologist in 1994, a missionary in 2001, a backpacking couple in 2008, a journalist in 2015. None were reported missing. No names were ever filed. And now it was 2022. The cycle was closing. On the last night before the next full moon, Lucas decided to burn the journal. Maybe it was the only way to break the bond, to sever the link. He went to the yard behind the inn, lit a fire with alcohol and matches stolen from the kitchen. As the flames rose, he felt relief. But then, from the fire, came a horrible smell, like burning flesh. The pages wouldn't burn. He screamed, poured gasoline, but the book only darkened, as if absorbing the heat. Then, a dry explosion, and the fire died on its own. At the center of the dead coals, the journal lay closed, untouched. On the cover, a new phrase had appeared, written in ash, "Now you are the season." And in that moment, Lucas understood. He was not the victim. He was the replacement, the one chosen to carry the cycle forward. The land didn't want to kill him. It wanted to plant him. It wanted him to bloom. Lucas spent the following days in a liminal state, caught between delirium and revelation. He was no longer just an agronomist in search of traditional cultivation methods. He was now the guardian of an ancient secret, repulsive yet fascinating, a chosen prisoner, and in the eyes of the village, an inevitable successor. He woke every day with mud on his feet. Shadows watched him through the windows. The walls of his room seemed to breathe in rhythm with his chest. Every spoonful of food served by Donna Irene tasted of involuntary acceptance, the digestion of a fate that could no longer be undone. But amid the growing darkness, something bloomed. Not faith, but resistance. a spark. Lucas knew that if he was part of the cycle, maybe he could corrupt it from within. He also knew that the next ritual was near. The entire village prepared in silence, with averted gazes. Streets too clean, candles lit without reason. As he passed a group of children, he heard a rhyme that chilled his blood. Who listens to the earth becomes a cob, who shuts their eyes becomes a root. He decided to act. He hid in the woods for 3 days, living off roots, sleeping in abandoned sheds, copying symbols from the journal and cross-referencing them with information found in church records. Among the ancient writings, he found mention of a corrupted artifact, a ritual object rejected by the land, a shard of black mirror shattered during a failed sacrifice. According to the texts, this mirror had imprisoned a fragment of the earth's spirit and, if used properly, could temporarily sever the bond with the soil. The item had been buried at the base of the Alakrim cross, a forgotten protective symbol hidden deep in the field. Lucas dug for hours, his hands bleeding, nails broken, until the blade of metal struck something cold, a small oval mirror, cracked down the middle, with symbols carved into its charred wooden frame. When he touched it, something stirred inside him. A voice whispered into his mind, not with words, but with memories. He saw the faces of the disappeared, felt their pain, their hunger, their forgetting. And then he understood. The mirror did not set one free. It exchanged. It passed on the weight of sacrifice to whoever dared to use it. But that was all he needed. On the night of the ritual, Lucas returned to the cornfield. The farmers were there as before. Dark robes, guttural chants. At the center, a new offering, a young woman gagged, on her knees with bruises on her wrists. He recognized her face. Maria Teresa, granddaughter of a farmer he had spoken to in his early days. Her eyes were terrified, yet aware. She knew where she was. She knew what was coming. Lucas didn't hesitate. He walked toward the circle, unimpeded. The cult members looked at him with silent reverence. Seu Otacilio stepped aside, smiling. "Have you come to make your choice?" the old man asked. Lucas pulled the mirror from his backpack, hidden under a cloth, and instead of answering, he stared at the altar and said with a firm voice, "Tonight, the earth harvests what it sowed." In one swift motion, he placed the mirror on the altar and cut his own hand, letting his blood drip onto the shattered surface. The reaction was immediate. A dry wind swept the clearing. The torches went out on their own. A tremor rippled through the ground like the earth itself was screaming. The mirror glowed red, then cracked further until it turned to ash. The cult members stumbled back in panic. Some screamed. Others collapsed to their knees, as if being pulled into themselves. From the earth, twisted roots began to rise like serpents, coiling around the legs of the gathered. Seu Otacilio tried to flee, but tendrils sprouted beneath his feet, dragging him toward the center of the cornfield, where the crown of scarecrows spun in a macabre ecstasy. Lucas rushed to Maria Teresa, cut her restraints, and pulled her from the circle. Behind them, the ground split open in cracks, as if digesting its own children. There were no more chants, no more cult, only moans, and the earth, starving, receiving its own harvest. At dawn, the village was silent. The crops had withered. The houses stood empty. There was no sign of the old villagers. Lucas and Maria walked in silence to the road, and for the first time since his arrival, it led outward. But something still pulsed in the air, and as they walked, Lucas noticed a small corn sprout growing from the sole of his shoe. Green, alive, unstoppable. Days had passed since their escape. Lucas and Maria Teresa reached a nearby town unnoticed, covered in dust, eyes sunken, their bodies and souls in tatters. They were taken in by a charitable old woman who believed part of their story, that they had gotten lost during rural work, spent days trying to find their way back, witnessed something horrible. The rest of the tale was swallowed in silence, for how could one explain ancestral rituals, living scarecrows, and a land that devours people with a hunger for memory? How could one make believable something even the spirit could barely comprehend? Maria was welcomed by distant relatives. Lucas, meanwhile, headed to Belo Horizonte. He began sleeping in cheap hotel rooms, never staying in the same place for more than a week. He started to feel things, small things at first. plants sprouting in windowsills where he stayed, corn kernels appearing in pockets he was sure he had emptied, patches of soil manifesting under his feet after long showers. He tried to forget, tried to rationalize, tried to bury the past. But the past is not something that can be buried without consequence, especially when the soil remembers. One night, he woke to a familiar sound, the sound of leaves rustling, not in the street, not in the hallway, inside the room. He stood up, trembling, and saw a corn cob growing from the carpet, tearing through synthetic fabric like a seed starved for light. Around it, small roots crept forward like fingers, reaching toward him. He tried to run, but his feet were trapped. Looking down, he saw thin vines wrapped around his ankles, as if the earth itself were recognizing him, reclaiming what was hers. He fell, screaming, tearing at the plants with his hands. Blood and mud, mud and blood. He escaped the boarding house in panic, barefoot and shouting, never to return. People said he'd gone mad, but he knew the truth. The cycle had not been broken. It had merely transformed. The earth had not killed him because it had chosen him. He was now part of the new pact, the one who carries the cycle, the season that walks, the soil that breathes in human form. That's when the blackouts began. He'd vanish for hours, wake up in different towns, with fragmented memories of wandering rural trails, meeting curious farmers, handing out traditional seeds, those same ones too golden to be natural. Sometimes he dreamed of Zé Raimundo, now with a scarecrow's face, whispering words that woke him soaked in sweat. He dreamed of Sir Otacílio, smiling from beneath the ground, and of the chance, always the chance. One day he awoke on a bench in a small town square in Goiás, holding an envelope in his hands. Inside, a single folded sheet with the drawing of the Alacrim cross, the ancient symbol of protection that once tried to stop the curse, and a single sentence: "I planted just like you said. The harvest was good." Lucas understood. Without ever physically returning to São Braulino, he had spread his roots, scattered seeds, started a new cycle in other lands. He was now the link, the bearer. He no longer needed an altar. He was the altar. And the soil, satisfied, merely dozed. For now. That very night, under a clouded sky, a group of farmers in a small southern town celebrated a miraculous harvest. Abundant grains, fertile soil, no effort. Only a promise made to a stranger who left them a sack of seeds marked with a burned-in symbol. In the distance, a new scarecrow had been raised, its skin still fresh. Time passed. But how does one measure time when it bends to the will of the earth? When the seasons stop obeying the calendar and begin to follow the whims of something that sleeps beneath the fields, waiting for the right moment to germinate again? The story of São Braulino vanished, as if it had never existed. The records were erased, the roads overtaken by weeds. The village's name no longer appears on any map, as if the world had healed from it, or perhaps learned to ignore it, like a body ignoring a tumor it prefers not to treat. But Lucas Moreira still existed, in part. At the university archives, his name remains listed as on extended research leave. Some colleagues claim to have seen him briefly at events on sustainable agriculture. Others in blurry photos from mystical gatherings deep in Bahia. A few swear they crossed paths with him in villages where the land felt more alive than normal, but no one knows for sure. His face changed, his voice too. What remains of him are traces and seeds, small envelopes handed to humble families, always accompanied by a handwritten message in simple script: plant with faith and harvest in silence. In every place where the seeds sprouted, miraculous harvests followed: towering corn, wheat free of pests, trees bearing fruit out of season, and with the abundance came the whispers, first on full moon nights, then at noon. Then time stopped, and roots climbed the walls of the houses, and the scarecrows began to smile. In a rural school, a child once drew during class a faceless man burying something in the ground. When the teacher asked who it was, the child replied, "It's the corn man. He talks to the earth, and the earth listens." Today, there are scarecrows in places that never needed them. Today, there are cities harvesting crops they never planted. Today, there is a new seed, planted, watered, silent, waiting for the next season, waiting for you.